This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
I want to start with Professor Pahlavi. I want to know what your thoughts are, given your response to, I think, to another testimony about whether you think Canada is naive for their, frankly, slow nature in not listing or refusal to list the IRGC, which you...
Yes, I agree with that comment. Canada in the international community seems naive and not wanting to act in this situation. And the idea that we're not affected by what's happening in Iran is a mistake and a moral problem.
What do you believe that it will do for the diaspora community here to know that calling a terrorist would maybe help? Or the second question, actually, is what do you think it will do to our international standing with some of those who I think have been putting pressure on us to act more vigorously when it comes to calling a terrorist a terrorist?
Alors, je dirais que ce serait une décision qui...
So I would say that would be a decision.
Some of us are not getting translation. Can we double check, please?
Dr. Fry will look right into it.
This is the interpreter speaking.
So let's see, maybe it'll work now. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that, Professor Pahlavi. Please do proceed.
Alors, je dirais que...
So I would say that if Canada were to take the decision to list the IRGC on the international list of terrorists, it would be perceived very positively by many of our compatriots of Iranian origin living here in Canada. And this would most certainly contribute to a better perception of Canada. The Americans have already placed this group on the list, and I think we would seem much more serious if we decided to do it.
Thank you. Thanks to this. Dr. Juno, you said that Canada doesn't have or doesn't do enough to combat IRGC. We know that, there's no secrets, there's all this money laundering operation in Canada, IRGC, Hezbollah, the Hells Angels. There's car dealerships are owned in Ontario by these groups. The cars thefts in Canada and exports to overseas. This is another act of money laundering is happening every day. Real estate, however, retail, money exchange, all these operations are obvious there. And we're still not doing anything about it. It's hurting the Canadian economy more than anything and the Canadian people. The safety, the security, the inflation, it's hurting everywhere. Why, in your opinion, why we're not doing anything about that? Why?
Why is hard for me to say. I would say that in general, Canada does not do enough on the national security front. I think that's true in general on multiple threats that we face today, and it's definitely true on the issue of Iran and the IRGC, as I think I emphatically said in my presentation. To me, my whole point is that the best way to counter IRGC activities here, including the ones that you described, as well as multiple others, and I would really emphasize the transnational repression aspect against dissidents and human rights activists here. The most effective way to do that is targeted measures and using some of the tools at our disposal. It's very easy to dismiss concerns about resources, scarce resources, as despairing, but in the real world, resource constraints are real, and they prevent us from doing things that we should be doing. These resource constraints are absolutely severe. Therefore, I think targeted measures would be much more effective. Same thing on the issue of reputation. What hurts our reputation the most is not listing the IRGC. What hurts our reputation the most is the fact that we announce measures and don't actually enforce them, which would be the case with listing the IRGC, realistically.
So the answer is listing IRGC as a terrorist organization in Canada is the only way and the most effective way to combat this. Otherwise, we're going to continue watching the same organization hurting and attacking Canadians' lives and the security and safety of Canadians every day. Is that correct?
That is not my position. My argument is that the most effective way is to use more targeted and surgical tools that we have at our disposal. That would be more effective and more resource effective.
Are you suggesting another infrastructure?
Nope.
You still
I'll
have
take
35 seconds.
35 seconds. So to go back to the infrastructure, how severe the infrastructure of IRGC in Canada, in your opinion?
As I emphasized in my presentation, the IRGC threat to Iranian Canadians and to other aspects of Canadian society and life is a severe threat, absolutely.
The amount of money laundry that you think they're involved in, any idea if there any estimation out there?
I have never seen a number in the public domain. I think there's a big problem, notably with the parking of financial assets, but I don't have a number.
If anyone to estimate the number of members involved here, in hundreds or in thousands?
You mean members of the IRGC?
Yes.
Again, in the public domain, I have not seen numbers at that level, so I'm not in a position to answer that specifically, beyond saying that it's a serious problem.
Security has become globally rampant, or the lack of security, because we see that we're having problems, including with Iran, when they are also the ones who are helping Russia, and therefore any sanctions we've applied against Russia is not working very well. We've seen that. So how do we deal with the IRGC and its activities in Canada, given that they're not going to apply to come to Canada saying, I belong to this group. They're going to come in under some kind of other heading. And how do we know? How do we flush them out? That's the first thing. If we're going to apply sanctions against them in Canada to protect our own Canadian Iranians, how do we do that? Because it's like trying to tie down a sort of slippery fish. How do you do it? That's the first thing. The second thing is, how many of the other countries, like Hezbollah, etc., that are helping them, and how do we deal with their influence out there as well? Those are two questions. Thanks. I won't ask any more. Samir will probably ask others. Just could I get answers to those two questions? Okay, somebody start.
Is that a question to me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. How to, act on the ground? I think that it's hard to say that in 1 minute, but I think our two main tools are tools that, if we better use them, can be quite effective. The Special Economic Measures Act, which allows us to list individuals and entities and impose a number of sanctions on them, including financial sanctions and so on. That can be quite effective if properly enforced, which is not the case at this point. And the other tool that the current government brought in about 1.5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, is through the use of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which allows to bar from entry and impose a number of additional sanctions to a number of officials within the regime, i.e. not only the IRGC. I think it's difficult to assess properly what the success of that has been so far, because there's very little publicly available data, but it is, to my mind, a tool that we can also use. The other aspect of your question, which is partners of Iran, I think that's an important question. Hezbollah in particular has a number of financial networks that are involved here in Canada, but also throughout the world, in parts of West Africa, of South America, very extensive. And I do think that Canada can do more to counter these financial networks here. And beyond the issue of these financial networks, one thing that Iran has done a lot in recent years, notably with the Houthis in Yemen, is to build an extensive global network of smuggling to send weapons parts of missiles, parts of drones to Yemen in particular, but to Hezbollah, to Hamas. The U.S. is leading efforts to counter these networks, and I do think that Canada could play a stronger role, for example, in the Red Sea, to participate in multilateral efforts to counter these.
Mr. Pavlovi, your hand was up.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Fry, for this question. Je dirais que
I would say that what characterizes the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, it's a threat that has many shapes, multi-facets, 360 degrees. These people are involved in activities in cyberspace, in the ballistic program, in the nuclear program, in smuggling of parts. They're present in Sudan and Latin America. They work in Central Asia. They work in the Caucasus. They have their hand in plenty of different files. And so to answer your question, the good approach to for approaching this phenomenon that is has so many shapes, it's to act in a similar way that's multifaceted. I agree with Dr. Juneau about a targeted approach, but that does not prevent complementing it with other means. The Revolutionary Guards are a ideological and political army, and to list them in the category of terrorist organizations is to respond in kind to the phenomenon. It's complementing the approach by various means and attack them in a systematic way.
I'm concerned, as a parliamentarian for Canada, what Canada should be doing in the area, given the horrifying humanitarian situation, the suffering of Yemenis under both the Houthis as well as the Saudi war, which was, of course, we know, supported politically by Canada, the desperate need for real peace and a real diplomatic solution. What can we do in this case that would benefit the people of Yemen, who we know have suffered so greatly at the hands of both warring parties?
Thank you. Just to build on what I said in answer to the previous question, the reality right now is that the Houthis have won the civil war in Yemen. They do not control the entire territory of the country, but they control about 60 to 70% of the population. And politically and militarily, they are by far the strongest actor in the country. That is very bad news for the people of Yemen, because the Houthis have shown to be absolutely brutal in terms of their administration, and it's bad news for the region because now they are exporting that brutality outside the borders of Yemen. We suspected that for years, but now we actually see it in terms of what they're doing in the Red Sea. And the problem is that that is not going to stop. A ceasefire in Gaza, for example, is a separate discussion, but it is not going to stop the Houthi threat to the Red Sea. It is independent of that. So from a Canadian perspective, I think we need to support U.S. efforts to counter the Houthis because that is good for regional security and ultimately it is good for the Yemeni people. How do we do that? Participating in the maritime mission in the Red Sea, even if it's a symbolic participation as it is now, it's better than nothing. If ever we have a ship to spare, which is not obvious, then I think that would be a good idea. Beyond that, there's just not much of a political process in Yemen right now because the Houthis are not interested in it.
Yeah, and I suppose, having a feminist foreign policy or purported to have a feminist foreign policy means that we should be looking at ways that we can end the impact on women and children, which we know are the ones that are feeling the brunt of this conflict the most. Speaking of our foreign policy, one of the things that you spoke about was the fact that Canada has a reputational risk because we are not following through on what we promise. So we say one thing, but we don't follow through on that. That's been the problem with using sanctions as a cornerstone or as a large piece of our foreign policy, is that we have no ability to enforce those. We're known as being quite good at putting people on the list or putting entities on the list, but the follow through and the enforcement of those sanctions is of course very weak. You mentioned that there is significant harms to Canada's reputation or potential significant harms to Canada's reputation from this. Can you describe that a little bit more for me?
That's an extremely important point, and I think that in general in Canada, civil society, media, political level, we really underestimate the damage to our reputation of being free riders or easy riders on defense and national security issues, of underinvesting in these issues. It's true for sanctions, as I said, but it's absolutely true beyond sanctions. Whether there's a reputational risk in the global south, to be perfectly blunt, I'm not especially bothered by that. There's a significant reputational risk with our allies in NATO and especially in the US, and that's what should really bother us. Especially because as the 2020s and the 2030s go by, more and more multilateralism, on which we are so dependent, is about what you bring to the table. It's not about your reputation as a do-gooder or anything like that. And what we bring to the table is limited. And more we are not going to be invited to ad hoc multilateral arrangements. Think about the AUKUS working groups, for example, and multiple other examples. So whether it's sanctions or something else, we need to be much more coherent and consistent at this level.
Well, and one would think, too, that the fact that our reputation is weak with regards to sanctions and other areas within the multilateral fora, also the idea that we are sort of backpacking on our reputation that was perhaps something that we had from some time ago. I mean, we are losing that reputation as well as being, as you put it, do-gooders in the global community. You know, we've seen that we have not been very coherent with regards to support for international law. We have not been very coherent with regards to support for trade and Canadian impacts of Canadian companies working abroad. So there's been a number of times where our foreign policy has not aligned with the actions that we do on the world stage, and of course we will see the impacts of that as we go forward. So one of the things you talked about was not having enough resources dedicated to things like sanction enforcement, that we have not added those resources. Can you talk a little bit more about what it could look like and what other countries are doing with regards to ensuring that these things are adequately resourced and given the tools necessary to do the job?
Well, the first thing I would say is the last point I mentioned in my presentation first, which is the need for more transparency at this level. Generally speaking, we are not very good at transparency on the national security, foreign policy front, and that goes on the sanctions side. So I am not in a position to give any numbers to quantify my answer. This is based on research and conversations and interviews and informal parts of my work on a regular basis, and also as a former government person. In a nutshell, whether it's CSIS, the RCMP, CBSA, and also foreign affairs, global affairs, which plays a major role now in terms of coordinating these issues, the international trade side of foreign affairs, there is very simply a need for more resources, more human bodies, and more money. If you look at OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is the U.S. office that manages sanctions in the U.S., it is gigantic. We are not the U.S. and we never will be, but proportionately we are nowhere close.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's good for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MP McPherson. Given that we have a few minutes left, I'm going to ask two questions. First of all, Professor Junot, I completely understand the arguments you've been making regarding resource management, and that's fair enough. But what concerns me is I have not seen us do anything concrete to deal with all of the activities the members were asking you about, whether it's money laundering, whether it's transnational repression. There's been very, very little concrete action. What is the risk of that? Does that not embolden the Islamic Republic and the IRGC as well?
Well, the simple answer to that is yes. And this is something that I and a number of my colleagues have been saying for years now, that we have been neglecting national security issues. The IRGC is in that list of threat that we have been neglecting, but it is far from the only one. Look at the whole debate on foreign interference that is going on right now. I would bring you, for example, to your attention the report that a number of my colleagues and I did at the University of Ottawa 2 years ago, a task force that had a number of former directors of CSIS, former national security advisors, former deputy ministers of defense and foreign affairs, and the bulk of that report was a call to action on the costs of neglecting all of these threats, which included the IRGC, but that was only one of the many, many threats we highlighted: cyber, economic espionage, money laundering, terrorism, extremism, China, Russia,